Imagine opening your phone one morning and seeing a headline that makes your heart drop. Jennifer Hudson's son is with David Otunga. For a mother, that sentence alone could feel devastating. But behind that shocking headline was a family story far more complicated than the internet could understand. Jennifer Hudson had spent years building her dream life. She had the career, the fame, the awards, and the spotlight. But behind the glamorous cameras was something she valued more than all of it: her son. Then everything changed. Her relationship with David Otunga came crashing down after nearly a decade together. What began as a private breakup quickly turned into a public storm involving custody. Lawyers, serious allegations, and two parents fighting to determine what was best for their child. And suddenly, the woman millions knew as the powerful Jennifer Hudson was facing a situation no award, no hit song, and no Hollywood connection could magically fix. Her son was spending time with his father. The headlines exploded. Fans started asking questions, and Jennifer's private heartbreak became public. Entertainment. But here's the twist nobody saw. David Jr. didn't disappear from Jennifer's life. Years passed, the courtroom headlines faded, the cameras moved on, and the little boy at the center of the storm began growing into a young man. Then, in a deeply emotional moment years later, Jennifer and her son shared a moment that revealed something the old headlines never could: that family relationships can survive even the most painful chapters. So what really happened between Jennifer Hudson, David Otunga, and their son? Was Jennifer truly crushed when David Jr. went with his father? Was the custody battle as dramatic as the headlines suggested? And how did this family move forward after one of Hollywood's most talked about breakups? Stay with me, because we're going back to the moment everything fell apart, and following the story all the way to the emotional chapter that changed everything. Before the custody headlines, before the lawyers became involved, and before Jennifer Hudson's private family life suddenly became a subject of intense public discussion, there was a relationship that had lasted for years and, from the outside, appeared to be built around love, ambition, and a shared desire to create a family together. Because Jennifer Hudson and David Otunga had entered each other's lives during a period when both were building careers in completely different worlds. With Jennifer establishing herself as a powerful singer and actress after her breakthrough on American Idol and Dreamgirls, while David was creating his own identity through law, television, and eventually professional wrestling. And although their professional paths were very different, their relationship gradually became serious enough that, in 2008, David proposed to Jennifer, and the two began looking toward a future that seemed to include marriage, family, and a life away from the constant pressure of Hollywood headlines. Then, in 2009, their relationship entered another important chapter when Jennifer gave birth to their son, David Daniel Otunga Jr. And suddenly the relationship was no longer simply about two ambitious adults trying to build successful careers, because they were now parents with a completely different responsibility. And for Jennifer especially, motherhood became one of the most meaningful parts of her life, at a time when she was also dealing with an extraordinary level of professional pressure, because her career continued moving forward with music, acting, television appearances, performances, and travel, meaning that she had to constantly balance the demands of being a global entertainer with the much more personal responsibility of raising a young child. From the outside, that balance may have looked glamorous, but behind the scenes, it required difficult decisions. Because being a successful entertainer often means spending long periods away from home, working on movie sets, traveling for performances, attending industry events, recording music, and maintaining a schedule that can change from one week to the next. While raising a child requires stability, routine, attention, and consistency, and somewhere between those two worlds. Jennifer and David had to figure out how they were going to raise their son, while both continued pursuing their own careers. For several years, they appeared to maintain their family life while keeping much of it away from the public. But eventually, the relationship began to change. And by 2017, after nearly a decade together, Jennifer Hudson and David Otunga were no longer moving toward the future they had once imagined. Because the couple had separated, and what could have remained a private family matter quickly became one of the most closely watched celebrity relationship stories of the year. What made the situation especially difficult was that this was not simply a breakup between two adults who could walk away from each other and start completely separate lives, because they had a child together, which meant that even though their romantic relationship was ending, Their responsibilities as parents would continue, and every disagreement between them now had the potential to affect the life of their son, making questions about custody, parenting schedules, travel, and daily responsibilities far more important than they would have been if there had been no child involved. Then came November 2017, when the separation became public, and Jennifer's representatives confirmed that she had been seeking legal protection for herself and her son, with a protective order becoming part of the increasingly complicated dispute. While David Otunga's legal team strongly denied the allegations and argued that he had not abused or harassed Jennifer or their son, creating two competing versions of events that would become a major part of the public conversation surrounding their breakup. And this is where the story became much more complicated than a typical celebrity breakup. Because once allegations, legal documents, and custody discussions entered the picture, the public began trying to decide who was right and who was wrong without having access to everything happening privately between the two parents. While Jennifer's supporters naturally focused on her concerns, and David's supporters pointed toward his role as a father. But the person most important to the entire situation was neither Jennifer nor David. It was their young son, who had suddenly become connected to a conflict that he had never created. During that period, temporary custody arrangements resulted in David Jr. spending significant time with his father, particularly while Jennifer was traveling for work. And although some headlines made the situation sound like Jennifer had simply lost her son, the reality was much more complicated because temporary custody arrangements are not necessarily permanent judgments about which parent is better. And in this case, the situation developed as part of an ongoing legal and parenting dispute in which both parents remained connected to their child. Still, it is easy to understand why the headlines created such a powerful emotional reaction. Because Jennifer Hudson was a woman who had built an extraordinary career while also trying to protect her family life. And suddenly, the same public that had celebrated her success was watching a deeply personal chapter unfold, with stories appearing about her relationship, her son, the custody situation, and the allegations surrounding the breakup, meaning that a woman who was accustomed to performing under bright lights was now facing a completely different kind of spotlight. Imagine what that contrast must have felt like. Because Jennifer could walk onto a stage in front of thousands of people and control the atmosphere with her voice. She could stand in front of cameras and confidently discuss her career. She could accept major awards and deliver emotional speeches. But none of those things could make the uncertainty surrounding her family disappear. Because when it comes to your child, fame cannot guarantee emotional security. Money cannot erase difficult conversations. And public success cannot prevent a family from experiencing painful changes. At the same time, David Otunga was presenting his own side of the situation through his legal representatives, and his team rejected Jennifer's allegations while emphasizing his role as a father, which meant that the public was now watching a conflict in which both sides had serious positions, and neither side was willing to simply disappear from their son's life. And although the public often wants a simple answer in stories like this, one person is the victim. The other person is the villain. The reality of family disputes can be far more complicated, especially when both parents remain important figures in a child's life. What makes this chapter even more emotional is that David Jr. was still very young when everything happened, meaning that while adults were dealing with lawyers, statements, custody arrangements, and media attention, he was still simply a child who needed to feel safe, loved, and supported. And that is why custody stories involving children should always be approached carefully, because the goal of a healthy parenting arrangement is not supposed to be about one parent defeating another, but about creating the most stable environment possible for the child. Eventually, the situation began moving away from the explosive headlines and toward a more structured parenting arrangement. And in 2019, Jennifer Hudson and David Otunga reached an agreement regarding parental responsibilities, with the details kept private, marking an important transition away from the public conflict and toward a new reality in which the two would have to continue raising their son, even though their romantic relationship had ended. That moment was important because it demonstrated something that celebrity headlines often fail to explain. A relationship can end without parenthood ending. A couple can stop being partners while still remaining connected through their child. And two people who once imagined spending their lives together may eventually have to learn how to communicate and cooperate in an entirely different role, not as boyfriend and girlfriend or fiancé and fiancé, but simply as parents. And while the world eventually moved on to the next celebrity story, David Jr. continued growing up, Jennifer continued building her career, David continued living his own life, and the custody battle gradually became a chapter in the past, rather than the entire definition of their family. But what happened next would become even more interesting because the little boy who had once been at the center of those headlines would eventually grow into a teenager with his own personality, interests, and relationship with both of his parents. And that is where the story begins to change. Because the question is no longer simply about what happened during the breakup or who had temporary custody during that difficult period, but about what happened afterward. When the cameras stopped focusing on the courtroom, the headlines disappeared. And Jennifer Hudson had to do something much more difficult than winning an argument. She had to keep being a mother while allowing her son to grow up in a family that looked very different from the one she had originally imagined. And as the years passed, something became increasingly clear. Whatever happened between Jennifer Hudson and David Otunga as a couple, their son remained the connection between them. And the story that once looked like it might permanently divide a family slowly became a story about learning how to move forward. Because sometimes the most important chapter of a family story doesn't happen during the crisis itself, but in the quiet years that come afterward, when everyone has to decide whether they will remain trapped by what happened in the past or find a way to build something healthier for the future. As the relationship between Jennifer Hudson and David Otunga began falling apart, what made the situation so emotionally complicated was not simply the fact that two people who had spent years together were going their separate ways, but that they were doing it while raising a young son whose life could not simply be divided into two separate stories. Because no matter how painful the breakup became, Jennifer would always be David Jr.'s mother, and David Otunga would always be his father, meaning that every decision made during those difficult months had consequences that extended far beyond the two adults at the center of the headlines. When news of their separation became public in 2017, fans who had watched the couple from a distance were suddenly confronted with a completely different picture of their relationship. Because instead of engagement announcements and family moments, the headlines were now dominated by legal proceedings, custody questions, and competing statements from representatives on both sides. And the situation became particularly intense after Jennifer sought a protective order and made allegations concerning Otunga's behavior. Allegations that Otunga's legal team denied, creating a dispute where the public could hear dramatically different accounts but could never see everything that was happening behind closed doors. And this is exactly where celebrity commentary can become dangerous. Because when a famous couple separates, people naturally want to choose sides, but when allegations are involved, the difference between an accusation and an established fact becomes extremely important. And in Jennifer and David's case, both sides had legal representatives speaking publicly, which meant that the story could not responsibly be reduced to a simple narrative in which one person was automatically the villain and the other was automatically the hero. While the adults were dealing with their legal conflict, however, another reality was unfolding, because David Jr. still needed a parent to be there for him every day. And reports at the time described David Otunga as having played a significant caregiving role, particularly during periods when Jennifer's demanding career required her to travel, which became an important factor in the temporary custody arrangements that followed. For Jennifer, this must have been an incredibly difficult balancing act, because her career was one of the very things that had made her successful. But the same career that allowed her to perform for millions of people also required her to spend time away from home. And anyone who has ever had to choose between professional responsibilities and family responsibilities understands that sometimes even a successful person can feel as though there are no perfect choices, only decisions that have to be made and lived with afterward. The temporary custody situation, therefore, became one of the most emotional parts of the story. Because David Jr. spent significant time with his father while Jennifer was working and traveling. And from the outside, the images and headlines could easily create the impression that something permanent had happened. But the reality was that the parenting arrangements were part of an ongoing legal process, and did not mean that Jennifer had suddenly ceased to be an important part of her son's life. Still, the emotional impact of seeing your child spend time away from you can be enormous, especially when the situation is happening during a breakup that is already painful. And Jennifer was not only dealing with the end of a relationship, but also with the pressure of knowing that millions of people were watching, discussing and judging her family situation, while every new report had the potential to reopen an emotional wound that she may have preferred to deal with privately. At the same time, David Otunga's position was also significant because he was not simply a former partner appearing in Jennifer Hudson's story, but a father who wanted to remain involved in his son's upbringing. and his legal representatives consistently pushed back against Jennifer's allegations, which meant that the custody dispute became less about a simple separation and more about two parents attempting to establish their respective roles after their relationship had broken down. The situation became even more complicated because both Jennifer and David had public careers, meaning that their private disagreements could quickly become entertainment news. And while an ordinary family might have been able to work through difficult conversations without strangers analyzing every detail, Jennifer Hudson and David Otunga were doing it under a microscope, with fans, entertainment reporters, and social media users constantly trying to determine what was really happening. But perhaps the most important thing to remember is that children do not experience family changes in the same way adults do. Because while adults understand relationships, legal documents, custody schedules, and financial responsibilities, a child often experiences separation in much simpler emotional terms, such as wondering when they will see each parent, where they will sleep, whether everything is going to be okay, and whether their parents still love them, which is why the best outcome in any family dispute should ultimately be stability rather than victory. And over time, the Hudson Otunga story began moving in that direction, because the explosive first months of the breakup eventually gave way to a more structured arrangement. And by 2019, the former couple had reached an agreement concerning parental responsibilities, with the details kept private, allowing their family situation to move away from the constant public debate and into a more private phase. When you look back at the Jennifer Hudson and David Otunga story today, it becomes clear that the dramatic headlines only captured one small part of a much bigger family journey. Because what began as a painful breakup eventually became a complicated chapter involving parenting, custody arrangements, public pressure, and two people who had to find a way to continue raising their son even after their relationship had come to an end. And while the world was busy asking who was right, who was wrong, and who would have custody, Jennifer and David still had something far more important to think about: their son and the life he would have to build after everything changed. The events surrounding their 2017 separation attracted enormous attention, with serious allegations being made and disputed, legal proceedings becoming public, and temporary custody arrangements placing David Jr. in his father's care for periods of time, while Jennifer continued managing her demanding career. But those circumstances should not be turned into a simple story about Jennifer losing her child, because the situation was part of a complicated legal and parenting process. And the years that followed showed that Jennifer's relationship with her son continued rather than disappearing. Perhaps the most powerful part of this entire story is what happened after the headlines stopped. Because David Jr. grew up, the family moved into a different phase, and the little boy who had once been mentioned in custody stories eventually became a teenager with his own interests, personality, and dreams, while Jennifer continued building her career and at the same time, continued experiencing the ordinary joys and challenges of being a mother. Then came that emotional Mother's Day moment when David Jr. surprised Jennifer on her own show with a cake and flowers. And suddenly the story looked completely different. Because instead of a courtroom, there was a stage. Instead of lawyers, there was a mother and son. And instead of a custody headline, there was simply a young man showing his mother that he cared about her, creating a moment that reminded viewers that one difficult chapter does not have to define an entire family relationship. Jennifer's emotional reaction made the moment even more meaningful, because it showed the kind of emotion that comes from watching your child grow up and realizing that the years have passed much faster than you expected. And while nobody outside the family can know exactly what Jennifer felt privately during the custody dispute, that moment gave viewers a genuine glimpse of the bond that still existed between mother and son years later. And perhaps that is the real lesson behind this story. Families can change without love disappearing. Relationships can end without parenthood ending. And children can continue loving both parents even when those parents can no longer share the same life together. Because David Jr. does not have to choose between being his father's son and being his mother's son. And the fact that he can maintain a relationship with both of them is not a sign of defeat for either parent. It is simply part of growing up. So when you hear the headline, Jennifer Hudson crushed after son goes with David Otunga, remember that the reality is far more complicated than those few dramatic words suggest. Because although Jennifer undoubtedly faced a difficult and emotional period during the breakup and custody dispute, there is no reliable basis to claim that she has permanently lost her son or that she is currently devastated because he spends time with his father. And the years since then have instead shown a mother continuing to love and support her son while he grows into the young man he is becoming. The past cannot be rewritten, and the difficult moments cannot simply be erased. But the future can still be shaped by the choices people make afterward, and in this story, perhaps the most meaningful outcome is not who had the upper hand during the legal battle, but the fact that David Jr. was able to continue growing while having both parents remain important parts of his life. Because at the end of the day, behind all the celebrity names, courtroom headlines, relationship rumors, and dramatic commentary, there is a family that had to adapt to a new reality. And there is a mother who continued moving forward, continued building her career, and continued watching her son grow, which may ultimately be a much more powerful story than the sensational headline that first brought everyone's attention to it. Now I want to hear what you think, because this story raises a question that goes far beyond Jennifer Hudson and David Otunga. Do you believe children can maintain a strong and loving relationship with both parents even after a difficult breakup? Or do you think public custody battles can permanently change the relationship between a parent and child? And what did you think about Jennifer's emotional reaction when her son surprised her? Did that moment show you that their relationship had grown stronger despite everything the family had experienced? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because I want to know how you see this story. And if you believe Jennifer Hudson's journey shows the strength of a mother who continued moving forward despite one of the most difficult chapters of her personal life. If you enjoyed this documentary-style deep dive, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications, because we bring you more emotional celebrity stories, relationship timelines, family dramas, and behind-the-headlines stories that go beyond the surface and explore what really happened. And remember, sometimes the headline tells you what happened,